that are moderately hot off the press from the National Centers for Environmental Information last week. First off, in terms of temperatures, the statewide average temperature was right at 60 degrees last year. That ranks as the 17th warmest year on record. This is based on data that they have going back to 1895. And you can see we were about a half a degree warmer than the latest 30-year average from 1991 to 2020. A little later on, we'll see how this compares with other recent years, but I'll sort of spoil that a little and say it's right in line with that. We've been warm in recent years, so 2022 definitely continued that fairly warm trend. Also looking at the precipitation, it was a drier year, the 38th driest year on record, again, based on 128 or so years of data. The average precipitation was about 4.5 inches below that latest 30-year average. And as we'll see through the presentation, that dryness was fairly persistent and stubborn through the year. We had a few drier months and also a few wetter periods, but for the most part, most of the year was just a little bit drier. So that dryness stuck with us basically all year in 2022. Now, zooming in a little bit more locally, wanted to highlight some of the different counties and stations across the state and where they ranked last year. This map also from NCEI shows a shading that any county where it's in this sort of beige color had one of their warmest third of all years in 2022. The orange colors means it was one of the warmest 10% of all years, and that includes areas like Raleigh and Wilmington and Hatteras. If you wanted to get closer to near normal temperatures, about the only place to go last year was in our very far western county in Cherokee County. Out in Murphy, they were still a little bit warmer than normal, but not quite in the warmest third of all years. You see also the pattern here. It was mainly across the southern Piedmont and the Sandhills, and then parts of the coastal plain as well, where we tended to see those warmest conditions. The precipitation ranking shows a lot more variability last year across the northern mountains and some of our northwest Piedmont counties, including in the Triad. It was actually wetter than normal, even in one of the wettest third of all years there. Also wanted to give a shout out to Highlands down in the southern mountains. This is the 5th year in a row that they've measured more than 100 inches of rain for the year. It was also their 6th wettest year on record. You can see most of the mountain counties were somewhere in the near normal range, but because of elevation differences, you can get places like Highlands that pick up a lot of moisture, and then areas elsewhere in Macon County that didn't see quite as much. So again, just wanted to mention that is our wettest spot in the state for 2022. Conditions dried out quite a bit as we headed to the east. Most of the coastal plain recorded one of their driest third of all years. And you see a corridor here really from Lumberton up toward Greenville, basically along I-95 and then down I-40 toward Wilmington that had one of their driest 10% of all years. That included Greenville, where they only had about 33 inches of rain for the year, about 14 inches below normal there. So again, some fairly sustained dryness, especially across the eastern part of the state last year. So you can see on this map where your county or where your local area ranked for the last year. Wanted to switch gears now and really tell the story of 2022 going season by season. And to start off with this, if you've been on social media at all over the past year or so, you've probably seen memes like this come out. Some claim that North Carolina has not 4 seasons, but 12 seasons. And some say that we can see all 4 seasons in the span of just a day or two. So I thought it would be fun to actually look at what our weather ended up as in 2022 and see if we could sort of map some of these seasons from the meme onto there. And I was really surprised that it works out really well. We started off with, again, all 4 seasons basically showing up in the span of about 3 or 4 days at the beginning of January. We were very warm at the start of the year, and then temperatures dropped a lot, even with some severe weather in there. Pretty much all of our cool and wintry weather was packed into 1 month in January. And then we started warming up by February. You see we had a few sort of false starts on the spring in March where it cooled down again. But then by late March and early April, we were well into the spring and of course the pollen season as well. One thing I think this graphic really helps to show, especially if you look at the normal temperatures, which are the shaded lines, and then the observed temperatures in Raleigh, which are sort of the spiky lines that you see, is just how much of the summer was above normal and how long those warm temperatures lasted. We first rose above 90 degrees in the middle of May, basically stayed there for the next 4 months, all the way until mid to late September. And then finally, our temperatures came crashing down on the first day of fall. We'll look at that in a little bit more detail later on, but that put us into what was a fairly seasonable fall. You see from the highlighting at the top, we had some wet days in the eastern part of the state, mainly from Hurricane Ian, and then some wet days in the western part of the state by mid-November, beginning with Nicole. So some shifting precipitation patterns that we'll talk about a little bit more later. And then, of course, the year ended up with that very cold weather over Christmas weekend, and then a warm up into more spring-like conditions after that. So again, a lot of backs and forths over the last year, but kind of amused and surprised at how well the 12 seasons and then some actually matched our weather from last year. I'll also just note that if you want to take a closer look at this graphic or even share it on your own, we will include it in the blog post that we'll send out right after the webinar. So we'll make sure that everybody who's on the webinar today gets that post in your email. So you can look forward to that a little bit later on today. If you wanted to stick just with our more traditional 4 seasons, winter, spring, summer, and fall, here's how those statewide average temperatures and precipitation compared. Again, this starts back with December of 2021 and runs through November of 2022. But overall, you see a lot of warm weather over the 4 seasons. In fact, all 4 seasons were at or above normal based on those 30-year average temperatures. It's actually not new. This has happened 4 times since 2016, where all 4 seasons have been at least at the normal level, if not above that. And again, you see, especially during the winter and spring and summer last year, that fairly consistent and persistent warmth that we had. The other thing you'll notice from the table here is that all 4 seasons were drier than normal over across the entire state. It's actually the first time that's happened since 2007. And if you've been around North Carolina for a while, since at least 07, that number might set off some bells, maybe some alarm bells in your mind, because that was the start of one of the worst droughts in our state's history. So we had drought last year. Fortunately, it was nowhere near as bad as what we dealt with back in 2007. And one reason, as we'll see, is that we had dryness, but it was fairly subtle dryness, kind of in the background. It was never too dominant with our weather over the past year. So I wanted to go through now season by season and talk about some of the major notable weather events and sort of how the patterns, especially the precipitation patterns, changed throughout the year. Like we mentioned before, most of our winter weather was packed into 1 month, which was January, but it was a fairly active month. On January the 3rd, on that Monday morning, we had a really strong cold front that came through and again, tried to pack all 4 seasons into one day, because ahead of the front on the warm side, we had warm temperatures and severe weather. The photo that you see here is from tornado damage in Harnett County that flipped over a building here. Behind the front, when a bunch of cold air poured in, it was actually cold enough and still had enough moisture for snow in the western part of the state. So some areas picked up a few inches of snow from that event. So again, a really big weather change just on that one day in early January. We'll skip ahead a couple weeks and then we get to the 16th. In terms of snow amounts, this was the big event for the year in the mountains. A number of places had more than a foot of snow. The photo that you see here in Boone was where they had about 10 or 11 inches of snow on that weekend. But then as you headed further east, it was more of an ice event. Down across the southern Piedmont and Sandhills, they had about a 1/4 inch glaze of freezing rain. And then right at the coast, it was more of a rain event. So as we expect in North Carolina winter times, you tend to get a little bit of everything. And that event on January the 16th was a good example. The weekend after that, it was finally the coast chance to get in on some of the frozen precipitation. This was a big event in the northeastern part of the state. The Elizabeth City had 6 to 8 inches of snow. Further south in the Morehead City area, and then also the Wilmington area, it was more of an ice event there. So one of their worst ice storms they've had in several years. And then finally, there was one more event the weekend after that on the 29th. This was a more widespread event, but fairly light for the most part. A lot of areas really between the Triad and the coast had maybe an inch or two of snow on the ground. So again, it was the last real snow we had for the season, but it was a pretty active one, at least for the month of January. We mentioned that by February, we started warming up and it felt more like spring. Well, by the end of March, it really felt and looked a lot like spring, because that's when we got into sort of this pollinating period. We saw a real spike in the tree pollen after we got rid of those last cold days and we started warming up again. And as soon as those tree pollen levels started going down, the grass pollen started coming up. So for an allergy sufferer like me, it was one of those long springs, really a long April, that wondered, is this pollen ever going to go away? And of course, you look outside, like the picture on the right shows, and there was just that yellow haze in the sky, yellow all over the cars and the ground and the roads and everything. So a pretty extended pollen season for us this past spring. The other pattern to point out over the spring was the precipitation and really how big of a difference there was, even across a short distance from the Raleigh area down toward the central coastal plain. The way the weather patterns had set up and the way the weather systems were moving through, a lot of them were bringing pretty heavy rain across the eastern Piedmont. And that rain basically stopped right when they got to I-95 to the coastal plain. Of course, there's nothing special about the road, but it does make a good landmark for us often to talk about the big change in weather across the regions. So what we saw was across parts of Chatham County and Lee County and southern Wake County, those areas had up to 2 times more rain than normal during the spring. You headed 30 or 40 miles south of there to the Fayetteville area and in Sampson County, they only had about half as much rain as they normally see during the springtime. And as a result, we started to see some dry weather and drought impacts over the spring this past year. By the end of March, there was a fairly large wildfire in Cumberland County that burned a little over 900 acres. So again, fire can be a side effect of drought, and especially during the spring, that's our usual key fire season. It did start to ramp up pretty early, and we had some pretty big events in those dry areas. Also, a little bit further east, right along the coast, these are places that don't have access to the same large reservoirs that we do in the Piedmont. So with those dry conditions in place going into the summer, some areas had started to issue warnings about water conservation and water restrictions, just to make sure they were going to have enough water to make it through the summer. So you see Pender County is one of the spots that was already in drought coming out of the spring and was a little bit worried going into the summer as well. In the summer, of course, the big story was our temperatures. Fairly hot overall, and that heat started pretty early. This table shows the daily temperatures in Raleigh. It actually works from the bottom up. So January is at the bottom, December is at the top. You see the first 90-degree day in Raleigh and really across most of the Piedmont and coastal plain was back on May the 19th. And I was cautioning people then, there's no such thing in North Carolina as getting the heat out of the way early. If we were that hot in May, that just meant we were going to stay hot probably through June and July and August. And you see, that's exactly what happened. We kept those 90-degree days around for the next 3 months, even into early to mid-September. We were still well into the 90s then. For the year to date, or the year total, actually, it was 81 days at or above 90 degrees in Raleigh, which was the 4th most all time there. And there were several other spots that had one of their top 10 most number of days at or above 90 degrees last year. You can also see just how abrupt that change was, which we'll look at on the next slide. But we went from 98 degrees on September the 23rd down to 75 the next day. So that was really the start of fall. Quickly, also wanted to mention the precipitation pattern for the summer. In this case, it kind of flipped from what we had in the spring. Parts of the Piedmont were a little bit drier than normal, and in the summertime, a lot of the coast was actually a little bit wetter than normal, or at least near their normal precipitation. One thing that was really impressive about that is that very little of that rainfall actually came from tropical systems. There was only one minor tropical storm at the beginning of July, which was Colin. It really brought fairly minimal rainfall totals, only about an inch of rain to parts of our southern coast. So instead, we had to do it the hard way, and we just relied on those pop-up showers and thunderstorms for most of the summer months. They were very well timed and very well positioned across some of those dry areas to really help bring those places out of drought later in the summer. So I think we probably got a little bit lucky there. It could have very easily stayed dry through the summer. And then we know how dry the fall was in some of those areas as well. But again, thankfully, we got the rain where we needed it. So then looking toward the end of summer and the first day of astronomical fall on September the 22nd, there was also, like we just saw, a really big weather pattern change then. We had a strong cold front that came through late that afternoon, and then this Canadian high pressure system that built in behind it, that brought in a lot more seasonal temperatures. The graph here shows the hourly temperatures in Charlotte. They hit 96 degrees on the afternoon of the 22nd. After that, when the front came through, it was a pretty steady drop all night long. They woke up the next morning to 55 degrees. So about a 40-degree temperature drop over the space of 16 hours or so. And the good news is that cooler seasonal weather actually stuck around for at least most of October. So it gave us the sort of really nice fall that we hadn't had in several years. Of course, one thing we always watch for in the fall is tropical systems coming in off the Atlantic or the Gulf. North Carolina was affected by 3 tropical systems in 2022. Like we mentioned, the first one of those was Colin, very short-lived storm, fairly low impact storm as well. And then not just in North Carolina, but across the entire Atlantic basin, it took almost 2 months before the next named storm formed in late August and early September. Finally, September was a little bit more active month, and we had one storm that affected us then. Of course, that was the remnants of Hurricane Ian that came in off the Atlantic, produced some fairly gusty winds in excess of 40 miles an hour across most of the state. Also, some pretty heavy rainfall totals, mainly across the eastern Piedmont and the coastal plain, some totals of 6 to 8 inches in some spots. And then in mid-November, we had our next storm, which was Nicole. Again, came in off the east coast of Florida. As it moved inland, it tracked across the western part of the state. So that was the big rainmaker during the fall for the mountain region. It also produced some localized flooding. But one interesting thing to note about both Ian and Nicole is that even though they produced some pretty heavy rain amounts, they hit areas that had been dry, that had been in drought. So they had a really beneficial impact overall. There were places even a week after the storms that we're talking about how there were very little traces of that lingering moisture sticking around. The ground was so dry, the soils were so thirsty that they really soaked up a lot of the moisture from those two systems. So again, often we rely on those tropical storms in this time of the year to help bring us out of a drought situation, and that was certainly the case back this past fall. We'll note that when Ian came up in the Wilmington area, it had about a 5-foot storm surge that crested the Cape Fear River in Wilmington up to about 7.5 feet, which was the 5th highest crest on record there. And you see the list of the top 5. That puts it in some pretty elite company. These are some pretty big, pretty memorable storms that also put a pretty high surge, a pretty high crest on the Cape Fear there. So from the photo here, you can see it also created some localized flooding in and around the Cape Fear River in Wilmington. And then on the other end of the state in the mountains, when Nicole came through in mid-November, it also caused some higher river levels. The graph here is from the French Broad River in Blantyre. You see it almost reached flood stage. And then some of the smaller creeks and streams, like the one here in Hendersonville, also spilled out of their banks. But again, overall, when Nicole came through, it hit a part of the state that had been in moderate to severe drought. So all that rain was definitely more helpful than harmful. I don't want to leave out December, even though it's technically not part of one of our seasons last year. It'll be part of the winter of 2023. December started on a warm note and it ended on a warm note, but I guarantee you 10 years from now, nobody's going to remember that about December 2022. All we'll remember is how cold it got on Christmas Eve. So as we saw, most of the country was in this very cold Arctic air mass during that Christmas weekend. Temperatures in the mountains dropped down colder than they had been in about 8 years. At Mount Mitchell, it was 21 below zero. Grandfather Mountain was 18 below zero, and we had some other sub-zero readings in some of our western areas. Across the Piedmont, a lot of single digits and a lot of teens across eastern North Carolina. I'll note that unfortunately, at least for snow lovers, this cold air came in after all the moisture had already moved through, so it was just a cold Christmas. But there were some areas in the mountains, especially at our higher elevation sites, that had temperatures just cold enough when that moisture came through to get some snowfall. So in places like Valley Crucis, they had snow on the ground on Christmas Day. So there actually was a white Christmas in parts of North Carolina this past year. So again, one of the common themes over the last year was just that persistence of drought conditions. And the drought that we started the year and actually began back in the fall of 2021. This graph here shows the progression of drought throughout the year. And again, it starts in October of 21, runs through the end of August in 2022. And the shading here just shows the percentage of the state that was classified in each US drought monitor category. We saw a big spike in those drought conditions back in the late fall, right after Thanksgiving in 2021. Conditions kind of improved during the winter time, but then by the spring and summer last year, we just saw that really steady, stubborn drought sticking around. It really wasn't getting a whole lot worse, but it didn't get a whole lot better either, at least until we got into late July and August. Again, especially when some of those rain showers at the coast really helped to make a dent in some of those rainfall deficits. But overall, between October of 2021 and August of 2022, we were in drought for 43 weeks in a row across at least some part of North Carolina. That rank is our 5th longest lasting drought dating back to 2000 when the US Drought Monitor started monitoring conditions. So by last August, again, we had seen the actual drought disappear. There were still some dry spots in the state, but we thought, surely by the time we get to the fall, these tropical storms will start rolling in and that'll lift us out of even dryness. Well, not so fast. About a month after drought disappeared on the map, it popped back up. And again, this was right before Ian. You see the map on the bottom left here, mainly in the northeastern corner of the state where they had missed out on some of those summer showers. It's also interesting to see just between these 3 maps how the drought moved around across the state. Sometimes I've compared it to a game of whack-a-mole, where as soon as you get rid of it in one place, it'll pop up in another one. Sure enough, after that rain from Ian improved things in the eastern part of the state, the western part of the state that missed out on the rain from Ian started getting drier. And then those areas saw pretty good rains from Nicole and then over Thanksgiving weekend. And then the dryness started shifting back to the east. So we finished up the year with drought in place across parts of the coastal plain. It's actually still there now. So we've now been in drought across parts of North Carolina for 13 weeks and counting. We'll certainly hope that we don't challenge that 43 weeks from last year. Hopefully the spring will bring a little bit wetter weather this year. But again, that's where things stand as of the end of 2022 in the first couple years of 2023. Wanted to mention there were some drought impacts. We looked at one of the wildfires and some of the water conservation down at the coast, but some stream and lake levels also dropped pretty low last spring and last summer. The photo that you see here is from Lake Wilson, and actually the town of Wilson put out a news release at the end of July noting that that lake had dropped about 6 feet below its normal level. The other thing they mentioned though is that that really was not affecting the city's water supply because they pulled their water supply from elsewhere. That was pretty common, a pretty common story across the state last summer. Even though some of the major reservoirs had started to drop a little bit, for the most part, water supplies were never really impacted that badly. Again, we had frequent enough rainfall to really help recharge those, and we never really saw that substantial drop like we saw back in 2007, for instance, where by the end of the year, there were pretty widespread water restrictions in place. In terms of severe weather, we had 19 total tornadoes across the state during the year in 2022. It's actually the same number as we had in 2021, but it is a little below the 30-year average of 31 tornadoes per year. The map here shows where they happened, and they were in all corners of the state. Swain County had a very rare mountain tornado back during the spring. You see some of the other events during the months of March and the months of May. One notable thing about last year is there were no tornadoes in the month of April, and that's actually climatologically the most common month of the year for us to see tornadoes and severe weather activity. The other thing to note is that the last tornadoes during the year happened during Hurricane Ian. There was one down here in Brunswick County, another up in Beaufort County, and I understand that tornado was in a fairly remote area, so the Weather Service was not actually able to get in on the ground and confirm exactly how severe it was. But after Ian moved through, for the last 3 months of the year, there were no tornadoes at all. So again, a fairly quiet April, a fairly quiet fall, both contributed to the overall lower than normal tornado activity last year. Now I wanted to run through some of the different sectors across the state and some of the impacts that they saw over the course of 2022. And we'll begin with agriculture. So even though it was a warmer year, especially a warmer summer and a drier than normal year overall, it was actually a pretty good year for agriculture for the most part. Again, a lot of areas, even if they were a little dry, they still saw the rain when they needed it. So crops like cotton and soybeans and sweet potatoes and peanuts, they were all generally in pretty good condition and generally ahead of their normal progress as they got toward the harvest time. The photo here shows the cotton crop in Lexington looks really great by the end of October. And then the graph on the right shows the progress in terms of the cotton bolls that had opened during late August through September. And in 2022, which is that brown bar, you see we were ahead of the 2021 progress and also ahead of the 5-year average. So again, most crops fared pretty well during the last year. The one big exception was the corn crop, and that's mainly because the month of June was hot and it was also really dry across most of the state. And June is usually a really critical time for corn. They're going through their silking phase where the silks are developing, and that helps pollinate the corn, especially so the kernels can develop. You see from the graph here that in 2022, that corn silking progress was a little bit behind the 5-year average and a little behind what we had in 2021. And for a lot of areas, the corn, if it really never developed properly in June, it was just behind for the rest of the summer. Also, that drier weather that we got into in the fall, especially in the Northeast, created some issues. The photo here shows a cornfield in mid-September. Not a lot of green on that corn, a lot of brown, a lot of yellow there. So for a lot of the corn growers, unfortunately, they did suffer an impact from some of the dryness. And again, mainly it was just that timing of the dryness. It was really when they did not want to see dry weather last year. Again, otherwise, ag fared pretty well. I know farmers always want to try to avoid any big storm events, especially because of the flooding and the wind risk. And again, we had some rain and some high winds from Hurricane Ian and Nicole. For the most part, though, we avoided the direct hit from those systems. So again, things turned out pretty well. Another side effect of drought conditions can be wildfires. So the preliminary statistics from North Carolina Forest Service shows it was a fairly active year in terms of wildfires. A little over 6,000 wildfires total on state and private lands, so not counting any fires on federal lands. And that actually ranks as the most since 2007. So again, 2007 coming up again. We know that was a very dry, very drought-plagued year. Of course, last year the drought wasn't as bad, but Again, we started warming up in February. We had dry conditions sticking with us basically all year in some part of the state. So these were mainly fairly low intensity, fairly small burns, but it did keep the Forest Service pretty busy because, again, they were popping up in all corners of the state throughout the year. Then in terms of the acreage, a little over 25,000 acres burned total. And you can see that's the most since 2016, but definitely nowhere near as many as we had in 2016. That fire season, of course, was mainly in the western part of the state during the fall. What we also see on here is that we had been in pretty good shape with fairly low fire activity for several years. 2018, 2019, 2020 had a fairly low number of fires and a very low amount of acreage burned. So in some ways, 2021 and 22 represent sort of a rebound. We're getting away from some of those very wet years into a slightly drier pattern, and we have seen some impacts like wildfires rebound with that. There were a few large wildfires last year, and one of the largest was down in Pender County at the Holly Shelter Game Land. This is the Juniper Road 2 fire. You see on the left the large fire scar from where it burned. A fire like this is not at all uncommon when we have fairly dry conditions in the spring and summer. These areas have these very organic, rich soils that can burn pretty easily, but usually they're submerged beneath the water table. During times when they do get a little bit drier, that water table drops, and then those areas can burn. And I think in this case, it was a lightning strike that caused this fire, and it did burn for several weeks over more than 1,200 acres. And then, of course, the photo on the right shows the smoke from those. In some past years, we've had impacts from the smoke filtering into populated places like Jacksonville. I think we had a little bit of that last year, but fortunately, most of that smoke managed to stay away from our major population centers. It makes a nice segue into air quality for 2022. And overall, it was a very good, a very positive year for our air quality in North Carolina. There were only 6 days total where our ozone levels reached the code orange or higher range, and there were no days where we reached the code red range. So really, this is a trend that we've seen over the last decade or so. It's been since 2012 since we saw even more than a dozen code orange days in a year. And that's mainly thanks to the efforts that regulators have made for regulating automobile emissions and factory emissions. That's kept the air a lot cleaner and kept those precursor emissions out of the sky. So even when we do have those hot summer days, we just don't see ozone forming like we did, again, 15 or 20 years ago. Also wanted to mention some of the impacts to tourism. Of course, we're mainly thinking about what conditions were like at the beaches, because that'll draw a lot of people during the summertime. This graph shows the normal temperatures and then also the observed temperatures in Wilmington between May and October. You see that it was fairly hot, especially by early June, then on through July and early August. But then after that, we had some fairly seasonable temperatures and then some ups and downs by the time we got into October. There were some very nice beach days, though. The photo here comes from Carolina Beach over Memorial Day weekend, so hard to argue with that. So some beautiful sand, some nice sunny blue skies. So again, I think for folks going to the beaches this year, they probably found some pretty decent weather. One thing that can impact tourism at the coast is when we have a storm event comes through. Of course, we know up and down the Outer Banks, those roadways like Highway 12 are very susceptible to overwash. Fortunately, the only times where we had any major overwash this year came outside of that usual summer beach season. There was one event in the middle of May when we had an offshore low pressure system that did push some sand and water over the roadway. And then in early October, right after Ian, there was also a high tide event that created some flooding along the roadway there. But again, during the heart of the summer and at least through Labor Day weekend, conditions seemed like they were in pretty good shape up and down the coast. And I don't want to forget about the mountains, because this really was a banner year for leaf color in the western part of the state. I've got Kathie to thank for sending me to a meeting in Asheville back in mid-October, and it was absolutely beautiful. So I hope you had a chance either to get out to that area or at least get out in your backyard and maybe see some nice leaf color. We know it was a nice leaf season based on the pictures like this, but we also know that based on the data itself. In order to get those really vibrant leaf colors, you really need two things starting around the beginning of fall through the month of October. One of those is very clear, sunny skies during the daytime. And in terms of those sunny daytime hours, Asheville had the most since 2016. You also want really cool nights, because that really gets those leaves in the mood for fall and ready to change colors. And this was actually the coolest October in Asheville since 1988. It's been 34 years since they had an October that cool. And you can see from the graph here at the bottom just how unusual that was. We were actually below normal in Asheville this fall. We've had a recent run of some very warm Octobers, so again, I think if you notice it felt more like fall this year, that's probably why, because our temperatures have certainly reflected the fall a little bit more than those recent years have. So for someone like me, who I consider myself a weather historian, I often think about perspectives on past years and how they can be remembered. What came to mind as I was working on this recap and on some of our blog posts throughout 2022 is just how familiar some parts of the year felt, especially some patterns and trends that it seems like we've been dealing with for years and years in a row, but also that we had some pretty big differences, some things that we haven't seen in our weather for several years that seemed to come back during the last year. So I'll give some examples of what I mean by both of these. First, in terms of those patterns that seem like they keep happening again, if you were with us last year for the 2021 in Review webinar, we talked about how each season switched back and forth from wet to dry. We called it this weather whiplash, going from wet to dry events. Well, as we saw, all 4 seasons were drier than normal overall last year, but within the seasons, we still did see some of those quick changes. During the summer months, June was very dry, and then July was fairly wet. In the fall, we had Hurricane Ian, which was pretty wet in the eastern part of the state, and then they dried out. Then the mountains were getting dry, and then they had Nicole and some other events in November. So then they turned wetter. So again, we're still seeing some of those back and forths from wet to dry spells. Also, in terms of the timing of our drought, again, back in 2021, we saw a drought pop up for the first time in October. Exactly the same thing happened last year within a week of when it happened the previous years. So both of those years had something in common, and that's that they really missed out on a lot of the tropical activity during the fall, during the month of October. So that is certainly another common ingredient between those past 2 years. This is also the 3rd La Nina winter in a row. So again, if you read our blog, you're probably sick of hearing about La Nina. I know I'm kind of sick of writing about it. I'd rather we get out of a pattern that's not going to be so warm and dry for the winter time. But again, that is something that we've been dealing with now for the past 2 or 3 years. And then, as Kathie will talk about in just a minute, this was a warmer than normal year overall. You saw how each season was warmer than normal. And that is a trend that we've been seeing really since the turn of the century, now 23 years ago. And then in terms of some of those big differences and what I'll call returning features of our weather, first off, one of those was snow. We looked at those snow events back in January. The map at the top here shows going into this past winter, the last time different parts of the state had at least an inch of the snow on the ground. Most of the southern Piedmont and Sandhills last saw a 1-inch event more than 4 years ago, back in 2018. But we had those pretty good covered snow events back this past January. So the map on the bottom shows almost all of the state outside of the immediate coast has now seen an inch of snow on the ground at some point within the last year. The other big change that we hadn't seen in a few years was those summer temperatures warming up as early as they did. That mid-May, May 19th period is about normal for most of the Piedmont. But again, it had been several years since we had seen temperatures that warm that early. Generally, we had been waiting until at least the month of June, but again, summer started early for us this past year. And as early as summer started and as miserable as some of those hot days were, we did have a very good seasonable fall that started right on time, at least according to the astronomical calendar. The other thing that I mentioned earlier is that we had been through a spell of several wet years in a row, including our wettest year on record in 2018 and the second wettest in 2020. That pattern is kind of reversed now. We've had 2 dry years in a row since then. So we certainly would not expect every year to be wet. We would expect to have that sort of balance. And the last 2 years have balanced out the wet with the dry a little bit. So at that point, I'll hand it over to Kathie. She'll give some more perspective, both locally, nationally, and globally about the past year, and then wrap this up for us. So Kathie, it's all yours.
Great. Thanks, Corey. The good thing about having a really talented staff is I get to sit back. I'm going to relieve Corey for about 5 slides, and then we'll do some questions and answers with all of you. So feel free to put those in the chat. So we're going to zoom out a bit from North Carolina, but we're going to start there first. So there's a way to visualize climate data, which is called climate stripes, and you've probably seen them around. They're for the globe. We have them for counties. We have them for cities. Corey created the climate stripes for North Carolina. And essentially what you see is red and blue years dating back to our historical record, so 1895. Obviously, a red year is warmer than normal, and a blue year is cooler than normal. And you can see this preponderance of warmer than normal years in North Carolina. North Carolina is warming. We've warmed about 1 degree Fahrenheit, and we're going to continue to warm. And each year since 2015 has been warmer than the 30-year average from 1991 to 2020. So we know we're seeing these warm years, even though we have things like a cold Christmas or the cold end of the year overall was warm. Next slide. So zooming out to the US a little bit, a lot of us traveled in the past year. We were certainly able to move around a little bit more after COVID. But looking across the country, again, it was a warm year across the US, especially out west. We saw big heat waves in California in about September when they're thinking they're going to cool down, but Los Angeles was topping 100 for a number of days. And then here on the East Coast, it wasn't a record-setting year, but it was warmer than normal. If you're in the middle of the country or have family in the middle of the country, you certainly heard about some of the cooler weather that they had. They certainly got a blast of Arctic air and stayed a little bit cooler, but still not the coldest on record. Next slide. And then precipitation wise, you can see we fared less well than our neighbors to the north in Virginia. Corey talked about our drought status. And essentially, there was a mix across the country. Again, California is unlucky. They had heat and they had drought again, another dry year for Texas and a wet year in the Northeast. So a mixed bag across the country. Next slide. And then globally, just zooming out a little bit more, we are all tired of talking about La Nina. It's a triple dip, third year La Nina. They are pretty rare. The good news is that it looks like we're going to ENSO neutral next year. So we will not send you blogs about La Nina anymore. But globally, according to NOAA, it was the 6th warmest year on record. And essentially, La Nina will tend to turn down the global temperature. So we don't expect to see the warmest year on record when we have a La Nina. And when you look at this global picture, you can see the La Nina in the equatorial Pacific, that area of blue, cool water. But across much of the globe, it was warmer than normal. There were heat waves in Europe during the summer. The middle of the US, again, was a little bit cooler than normal, but largely this all averaged to be 6 on record. 10 of the warmest years on record, dating back to 1880, have occurred since 2010. And we continue to see this warming trend across the planet. Next slide. And then just looking a little bit at how La Nina does tend to cool down the globe and El Nino tends to warm it up. This is just a very scattered figure that I would almost never show in a presentation if it were on a big screen, but we're on a Zoom. The red are El Nino years, the blue are La Nina years, and the gray are ENSO neutral. And you can see the red years, 2015's El Nino, warmest year on record, turned the global temperature up. But the blue years, the La Ninas, keep getting progressively warmer. So while we think it's going to turn down the global thermostat, we're also adding heat trapping gases to the atmosphere, which is kind of swamping out that cooling that we'd expect from La Nina. Next slide. And then just wrapping things up, go ahead and put questions in the chat. It was our 17th warmest and 38th driest on record in North Carolina. That does not roll off the tongue, and we had set some records in previous years. But 2021 and 2022 have reversed our wet pattern that we saw for about 7 years in North Carolina. We had drought lurking in the background, going back and forth, but it was at a pretty low intensity. What a hot summer. I know I was complaining about it a lot, but I was certainly happy to see fall. I loved seeing the pictures of leaves. I'm so happy that we had such a nice leaf season. And then January snow, we had Ian, we had Nicole. We thought we were going to get through the tropical season pretty well, but we had those two sneak up on us. And I just wanted to thank Corey. I learned so much from him every time I hear him speak. I've seen these slides, I've seen the blog, but I'm no longer new to North Carolina, but certainly pick things up from him. So please use this chance to ask him questions, ask him anything. And thank you for attending. So we have, thank you for the mountain shout out. This will be shared on our YouTube channel. Thank you folks for reminding me to record. You will miss my ramble in the beginning, but all of Corey's good info. Corey, you left them with no questions. You told them everything. Okay, so I will take this one. Thank you for your presentation. Are more counties in eastern North Carolina developing into flood zones? So we are seeing more extreme precipitation across the entire state, including eastern North Carolina. We're seeing increased development in certain areas. So the mix of land use and increasing extreme precipitation, we are seeing flooding in areas where maybe we hadn't seen it historically, or more flooding in areas where we'd expect it, but it happens more frequently. Will we be offering more programs this coming season? We tend to not want to hold a lot of webinars. We want to gather you when we have something to say. That being said, if we have something to say, we will certainly gather folks again. Corey, I'll let you answer this one. Will there be a summary page we can use for outreach with our communities and families?
So we are going to post a summarized version of this webinar on our blog. Again, it'll go out right after the webinar. And we'll also make sure anybody that's on the webinar today gets a link to that. So that's probably the best sort of summary that I would link you to. There's certainly a lot of tools as well where you can look at the nice maps and some of the graphics that we shared, but we'll try to condense as many of those as we can into our blog post.
Corey, I'm going to toss another one at you. Do any of these data come from citizen science projects?
Yeah, that is a good question. So I'll back up a little bit, it might be farther back. But one of the photos that I shared here, yeah, this one of the low lake levels in Wilson County, this was taken by a CoCoRaHS observer. If you're not familiar with it, CoCoRaHS is a precipitation monitoring program that started out in Colorado about 20 years ago. It's now across the entire country. And this is, I really mean this when I say it, it's truly one of the most important and most meaningful citizen science projects that we have available. And that goes for both observers that make daily precipitation measurements at their house, but also some of the condition monitoring observers like this person who every week or so will report what they're seeing locally in their area and can even send along photos like this. Later this afternoon, we'll have our North Carolina Drought Council call. And on those calls every week, we go over information reports just like this one. It truly does give us the best idea of what's going on the ground across the state. So there may be some other citizen science elements on some of these slides, but again, this is the one that came to mind first off, and definitely encourage you, if you're not a CoCoRaHS observer and if you want to be part of that precipitation monitoring process, please reach out to us and we would love to have you be part of that in North Carolina.
And we'll give you a gauge if you reach out to us within the next 24 hours. So, but you don't have to do it within 24 hours, but we have some gauges.
Hey, Corey, this is Alwyn. I'm up in Pasquotank County, Elizabeth City.
Yes.
And I will tell you this, I've been watching the drought monitor. In fact, I provide the information to the committee for that. I'm one of the, probably maybe the only one up here in the Northeast, but I had a little bit of, and I've talked with Dr. Yoder about this. I've had a little bit of disagreement on the way the color pattern, like I saw where y'all had that tan colored across the end of Pasquotank County. And it has really been dry. I'll tell you how dry it's been is that you see how on December there that you've got, well, you've got it as moderate drought. So it is actually more, but I've been noticing that some of this is not, it's really, well, here in November, it's showing abnormally. I would even say, and I can't remember the descriptors use that. I'm just saying, I don't know if there's, first of all, there's not enough people responding to the drought monitor in our area. But secondly, I don't know that we have enough weather stations to give a complete picture of our region. I mean, I've been comparing, I think the weather data that's used for our area, one of them is out of Elizabeth City at the Coast Guard base. And see, they're right along the river. So their weather could be much different than much of the area. I mean, I have a variety trial. I had one last year, less than 2 miles from the Coast Guard base. And correct me as to where that rainfall comes from. But we were about 10 inches less, and this is based on Climate View data. We were 10 inches less than the 5-year average at my trial, which is less than 2 miles from the Coast Guard base. I just think we need more official weather reporting up in our area, you know, with meteorological data, I mean, equipment to capture it.
Right.
So,
Yeah, I appreciate that, Al. Yeah, for one, I totally agree. I think more monitoring is always going to give us a better picture. I have passed along that request to our Econet team in case we were ever able to get an Econet station potentially in that corner of the state, especially like Pasquotank County. I'll also say that's been a tough area to monitor over the past year. For one, like you said, just because lack of observations, lack of reports coming in. But also we saw after Ian, those areas had pretty decent rainfall totals, but it seemed like they were back to being pretty dry the week after. So sometimes when it has been dry and then you have a big storm event like that, we know not all of that water is actually going to make it into the ground, into the soil. So it was a little bit tough to know then, exactly what kind of benefits they had seen and exactly, what was still dry there. So yeah, that's been a challenge.
yeah, but I mean, like right now, unless the tide, which our tides are influenced by wind, unless the wind blows the tides in, all of our canals, our ditches, our swamps are very, very dry. I mean, extremely dry. And that's to me, is a good measure of our water reserves. If the swamps are dry and everything else, then I'll be surprised. I'm really shocked. I mean, even the farmers will tell you, I don't know where the yields came from. We still had a fairly decent corn and soybean year, but it wasn't because we got plenty of rainfall. I can assure you that.
Right.
But I just want to report over in our area that it could be the same thing in other parts of the state. But and the reason I'm concerned about this is if this data is in any way used for FSA programs or crop insurance, if that is the case, that's where we need better data from this region or any other regions of a similar situation.
Right. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks a lot, Alf. That's really good information.
Yes, thank you for that information. We can't be everywhere, so it's good to have some eyes and ears on the ground. Corey, I'm going to send this to you and I can chime in too, because this refers to one of our other projects, but do you have data to show new unexpected species in North Carolina?
So I'm not aware of actually tracking different species, but we know that some species have different, I guess, weather indicators that will suggest whether they may be more able to thrive or to live in certain areas. So the one that comes to mind, strangely, is the armadillo. I think people have said we're now starting to see armadillos migrating northward from Florida and Georgia, and we've started to see more of those in North Carolina. So if you're ever out on the side of the road, don't run over any armadillos, please.
Yeah, and we do have a project with USGS and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to look at different temperature ranges and precipitation ranges to show how endangered species might be affected. So we're coming at it from the climate side and how it might apply to species, but you could also go at it the other way. So that should be coming out in the next few months. Corey, what do you expect in 2023?
The end of La Nina, finally. And I didn't include any slides with an outlook on it, but it does look like the La Nina is fading. It will probably be out of here by the spring. It's really tough to say exactly what might happen during the spring season. I have actually looked at some previous La Nina years where it faded in the springtime, and they flipped back to a wet pattern by the spring. So again, that gives me a little bit of hope. Maybe we could get rid of drought this springtime, but we've also seen in recent years that these backs and forths are so unexpected and abrupt. Kind of hard to know what to expect from one season to the next. So I'm starting to lose a little bit of hope for snow this winter because we are getting out of that climatological most likely time of the year. But in terms of precipitation, tough to know exactly what we'll see going into the springtime.
I saw some snow the other night, very early morning, in the street lamp, but that was the only snow I saw in North Carolina this year. I will answer this last question and then we'll let folks get on with your lunches and have maybe a Zoom break if you have another meeting coming up. Can you comment on how this information is used to inform government policy to address climate change? So we at the State Climate Office, we do original research on North Carolina. We do outreach and engagement, things like this, and we do monitoring. So we are doing science, we're doing research, and we will present these findings to state agencies. We work closely with them on contracts. We'll put information out on our blog, we'll write papers, but we don't ever prescribe policy to folks. We give people the best available science, which we are producing, and we draw from all sorts of peer-reviewed literature and all the other faculty at NC State. And we're working closely with folks, but we don't come up with policies on our own. We love crunching the data and the numbers and working through that. And I think Corey would agree. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for your time. It was really great to see this turnout. Thank you for your questions and your attention. You know where to find us, and if you don't, it's climate.ncsu.edu. That's where our tools are. You can find our email address and other ways to reach out. So thank you so much and have a wonderful day.